Hello, everybody. It's another episode of The Big Boys Table. I have a big boy in IskatuMesk, and we are here with episode 60. We're 9 away, and this one is called Picking Priorities. And obviously, as we intro this episode in, there's been some... I was going to call it nonsense, but really it's like... it's a shitty situation that Mesk is now facing. Yeah, it's like the culmination of the insanity that has been befallen this man for many years now, many decades perhaps. So rather than pretend that doesn't exist or that's not happening for the purpose of the show, we're just going to use that as the backdrop and sort of acknowledge that is indeed he's in a tough spot right now, and this means that he's going to be he's sort of like nose to the grindstone. There's a lot of things he has to get done for this December demo, and he's, as far as I know, this is like you're sort of trying to use this as a culmination of all of the game design and so on work that you've been doing. So you're really trying to put everything you can into this, despite all of the circumstances. So based on that, and you can kind of tell why we called the episode this, it's you kind of have to pick and choose what you can even do in that time. And then also sort of things have changed, because before maybe you could imagine doing other demos or continuing the work, and now that's all in question. So do you have any thoughts on what specifically you've been focusing on? You want to talk a little bit about the stuff that you've been trying to get done more recently, and like what your current big topics are, your big tasks are? I know you posted a little bit about them in your channel on the server, so I'm a little bit familiar with them myself, but for the average viewer who maybe isn't checking that stuff out or doesn't have access yet because they're not epic, what are you focusing on right now, given the circumstances?
Well, first of all, I'll apologize if I have to talk weird or whatever, because my tongue's pretty fucked up and I almost wasn't able to make this recording. So right now it just tastes gross and there's like a deep cut in my tongue and I have no idea how it happened. But for the last week, I've been having to try to wrestle with that. So, yeah. So, man, how do I even start? But really, it's like, I'm going to be homeless. Well, I pretty much am homeless now. The landlord basically came over a week and a half, 2 weeks ago and was like, you guys are going to be out in December, right? And we kind of like exchanged confused glances. And yeah, they're kicking us out. So, not unexpected, but obviously an absolute disaster. So it is worth mentioning that I never really planned for 2023. I never really had a plan after this point because I knew it was going to be shit, because everything is always shit. But I had always paced out things in such a way, it's like, well, I'll get to it later, right? So October happened, and that was also a tragedy and a disaster. And as a result of October, I obviously lost like an entire month of time that would have gone into this. So I had to cut stuff, and now I have to cut more stuff. So my priorities are like, initially, I was going to have what was called a first vision maps, and that was going to be effectively like a tutorialization. There was a lot of stuff that has to go into that. Like I have to have a toast system that shows you the inputs, and then do the voice acting for the memories, and then continue to fix up the young Anna character, which I had started on, and then make the maps and all this other stuff, and then tie that into the rest of it in a manner which at least flowed well enough to the point that you could demo it. And even populating the maps was pretty tough. Actually, something I need to test today is that a driver update may have fixed some of the nanite issues we were having, and that map was prominent for strange nanite issues. So if that fixes it, it'll fix Zeus too, which is another map that will be in the demo. There were a lot of issues with that. So there's just absolute chaos. But there was obviously a lot of things that were not going to make it into that. There was going to be like some cinematic stuff just to set the stage. Nothing really major, but all that has to get scrapped. I had a checklist of things I wanted to be in that demo. And as a result of everything that keeps happening, because shit's always gonna be fucking happening, I just keep taking, like, I have like the core things that are the most valuable, and then I have the stuff around it, kind of like, how many licks does it take to get to the center of Joe Biden? And in the side, you've got the sniffing. Like the sniffing is really the most important part and really the most defining feature of the left is just really creepy sniffing of minors. And then outside, you have the things that are less important, like, falling asleep during speeches or reading from a teleprompter or whatever. So, when we can only go into something and we don't have a limited amount of data, we may as well just focus on what's the most important. So obviously, how the character controls, how the enemies control, how the fight interactions go, and then the maps that we know for sure are going to be in there. So I just scrapped the entire first vision thing for this. So there's going to be no tutorialization or anything like that. I just decided I'm just going to have the inputs, and I actually have several text documents I'm going to release with this. And one of them just two of them just tell you the inputs. One of them tells you the details of the inputs. The other one's just a very brief summary. That's going to be our tutorial, right? There's nothing else to go for it. So as a result, the end user will have a harder time just to jump into it. I hadn't even at that point decided how I was going to do combat tutorialization because my initial goal was just to thrust you into a really hard fight initially, but there was nothing that tells you anything about what the inputs actually do. So I hadn't even designed that far, and by the time I was going to start thinking about that, I had to just drop the whole thing because we lost October. So, it's going to be a little rough for you, but that's a loss. So now, of course, we have this fucking lunacy going on. And I already don't have much time because it's just hard to work and stress in general. And I have some issues. So Arbiter has grown a lot since we last talked. Actually, not a lot of time has gone since we did the last Big Boys Table, but a lot of that time has actually gone into terraining and some of the other stuff. So Arbiter has grown about a third, if not about 50% at this point. And there's a lot more planned for it for December. So one of my big focuses is getting that map polished up, functional, and navigable. There are several areas in it I'm hypothesizing adding, and I need to decide on those. So the other core thing that kind of rose in priority as a result of that is the travel form. So pretty much everybody who has seen any extent of the demos for this knows that navigation is going to be kind of an issue. Because as we start going into longer maps, you need to be able to navigate them faster, particularly in the later half of the map where you've cleared out a lot of stuff and you just need to go to points either to open doors or find keys or something like that. For quite a while now, at least a year or something like that, I've hypothesized adding a travel form, which, yes, that is a direct reference to World of Warcraft and the Druid's travel form, where the Druid can just turn into something that moves faster but has no real combat ability. Of course, when we look at games with larger areas in them, like you're going to be doing Dragon's Dogma, that's one, Skyrim and stuff like that, most of the time navigation in those is really slow. So they introduce like map travel and teleportation, the bonfires and Dark Souls and stuff like that. Or we have selective mounts, selective movement speed increases. And these are usually something that is very, very heavily restricted. Like in World of Warcraft, you can't mount in half the game. You can't mount in combat. For the longest time, they were introducing all kinds of shit whose exclusive purpose was to yank you off your mount because they hated you running past stuff. They called it bypassing content.
Yep.
So, games still do that kind of shit today just to be annoying. And then in other cases, you have Skyrim and horses. And the horses in Skyrim are seriously some of the most demonically possessed, busted-ass shit in any game I have ever played. They are fucking messed up. Like, it is possible to land on a dragon, just get flung across the map. There's a whole horse tilting thing where, because the game takes velocity from your movement and the mounting process feeds it velocity data, you can save and load while mounting and get flung across the map like so fast that most of the map doesn't render, and that's a core speedrunning tactic. And, whenever we talk about mounts and travel mechanics and stuff like that, just right off the get-go, they're usually something that completely breaks away from the core gameplay.
Yeah.
So when I was going to introduce a travel format, I obviously didn't want that. I mentioned really early in, any kind of movement system I add to this is going to be a part of the core gameplay. So we currently have the mantling and the vaulting. Well, enemies can go over ledges too, so that's just, that's a given. But when you talk about more major movement things, like if you were to add, like, say, wall sliding, wall climbing, any of these other things that these kinds of games typically have, you start breaking further and further and further away. And with travel form, that's a really big detachment, because in mounts and stuff like that, the extreme vast majority of games do not have mounted combat, and when they do, it's an absolute train wreck. And it's usually its own special needs mini game kind of thing. You didn't want that. But there's also the fact that with the travel form, obviously in World of Warcraft, all it does is it just changes your model and then gives you a buff that increases your movement speed. And it's really jank. And now we're talking about having something that changes your model, will change your collision, and will probably end up changing your controls a little bit. And we still want it to be completely seamless, because there's no in-combat restriction for this. You can flip in and out of it at will. And then we have to think about, okay, so obviously this is going to be faster, and it's going to be used to bypass content. So how heavy-handed do you want to be with it? Well, I'm probably going to make sure that you have no stagger health at all in this as an exchange. You can use it to navigate the battlefield, avoid certain attacks that might be harder to avoid, or whatever, but there's risks associated with it. Now we turn it into something that can actually be used for a gameplay. So then we had to figure out how to actually do that. And then I had to have the assets all set up to do that. So that rose in priority as a result of everything else I did. And I had been putting it out to this point because, for one, I didn't have the assets for it. I was hoping to retarget the Rog Wolf onto the Poly Wolf. That did not work out because the IK retargeting turned out to be a lot more difficult than expected. Actually, I've made some breakthroughs in that, though, with something unrelated. So the other unrelated stuff, again, beyond the travel form, having that set up and at least usable so that you guys can navigate Arbiter without taking 30 minutes, is to have some more units in that map, because otherwise I've already shown all the content for that map. So we got to have new content. Mm-hmm. So what I will say is I am hoping to have a very basic, but something you can fight, a very basic surface level boss fight within that. I had said last time we talked about this, I wasn't planning to have any boss examples at all in this. I'm hoping to at least have one form of one concept boss, just in a sense that at least it's a stronger enemy than what we've had before. So I already have him kind of functional in the sense that he does all the stuff I set out initially for him to do, which is to introduce something called context-sensitive AI. So with AI, I have priorities subdivided in that. The initial priorities when I first started this back in 2019 was to have the AI navigate Z, able to jump levels, able to go over and under bridges, all the basic stuff that modern games cannot do.
Yeah.
And that was very easy to do. Well, half and half. It was easy to set up. Nav links are very finicky to actually hook into the level. So that's something I can't really control. Unless I had something like the Kythera AI engine, which I would probably have to have a multi-million-dollar license to possess. So that's obviously not going to happen. So, but I had to have the basics in, which I did. So beyond that, it was having the AI able to do stuff like teleport. Having the AI able to switch between melee ranged attacks and stuff like that. And we got that in. And then we start granulating down the list. Like, what do you want the AI to be able to do? Well, it needs to be able to function like a fighting game opponent. Now, notice I say a fighting game opponent as opposed to a human or a thinking creature.
Yeah.
Because AI doesn't think like people do. It never will. And that's, as we've talked about countless times, trying to make something behave like a person does is the completely wrong way to even approach AI. So we had to kind of break down what the AI can do well and focus on that first so we save time. So what can the AI do well? The AI can read the game state very well. So now we're at the stage where we're having the AI read game data and react accordingly. So what this boss will do is if you are staggered, he will focus on damage. If you're not staggered, he will focus on staggering you. So that's one basic one. Gundarvar, who is the game's first boss that I was going to introduce, and I showed very briefly when we did our actual visual demo a while ago. He also has a bunch of stuff in him that's new since then, but he probably will not make it into this in any form. He had more advancements on the smart step system where it is aware that there are ledges, so he will not jump. And all this was implemented in every unit now that uses that system, where they use dashes, evades, or something like that. And they have to be aware that there's a ledge next to them, so they don't just jump off the ledge like in Dark Souls. So that's already done. That was another core thing. Thanks to HKS, we got that figured out. So one of the things I want to do prior to December is to introduce that safety test into attacks as well, as there are units like the Templar that have lunging attacks that you hypothetically can bait them off into throwing themselves off of ledges with. It's kind of difficult to do, but it is certainly possible. I'll have a safety test put into those so that they will not usually use those if they're close to a cliff. It's probably still going to be possible to do it in some cases because they can't account for all the collision in the game since it's just a series of traces. But for I'd say 99% of cases, we can probably stop them from jumping off of ledges. So that even can be abused by the player too. If you're hanging around ledges, the AI won't use certain dangerous attacks.
Right.
And then maybe for certain creatures they will because they're dumb. But the Templar, for example, won't do that. So travel forum, Arbiter updates, having in some new creatures. Those are our primary objectives that need to be done for December at this point. I actually have an asset for travel forum now. I have stuff set up. I started working on it last night. Just this morning, I worked out the most severe of the bugs with it. Now I need to make it so you can't transform back if you can't fit. So there's some safety stuff that needs to be done. Like in World of Warcraft, for example, there's no real sense of collision whatsoever. So transforming in and out or whatever, you can fit. I have some great recordings of people using all sorts of items to increase their size. And they turn into a turn and then jump on a mountain. They're the size of a mountain, and you can just fit into a corner that's the size of like a gnome. Because there's no sense of collision. There's a sense of collision in this. And when you're in travel form, you're obviously a lot smaller profile. You can go under things or get closer to things you normally can. When you transform back, there's currently no checking whatsoever. You can get stuck inside of enemies that are attacking you. You can get bumped out of walls and stuff like that. So we need to have a check in place to prevent that. Currently, I don't know how to do that, but that's what I got to figure out. So that's really my big stuff at the moment. Because a lot of other core stuff, I have example dialogue. I have a audio system in that you can change volume levels. That's another thing I wanted, because when you guys do recordings, you're probably not going to want the music on. And a lot of other kinds of stuff is sort of in. Anything else is extra. I still need a lot of effects and stuff. I actually discovered a lot of weird things in the last while when I was trying to set up footstep sounds for the Templar. So polishing up what we currently have. So that is my priority. I'm keeping it very short and sweet because, the current circumstances are at the stage where I don't know if I'm going to be able to get that done.
I like the idea of what you described as some enemies might still do stupid things because they are actually meant to be stupid, or they're meant to be hyper aggressive or reckless or something, right? And so I do like the idea of playing around with that. I've thought about AI design, monster design in a environment that isn't an RTS, right? And enemy design really broadly. I've thought about that, and I've been thinking I have a hard time justifying pulling punches in an RTS context, where I feel like it's actually bad if you have this player who is dumb, right? This opponent, this enemy commander who is just not as accomplished or something to that effect. Because it feels like if he's your ally, then that's weighing you down, and if he's your enemy, then it's not as engaging as a fight as it could be. And so I do recognize that there are ways to get that implemented in a way that's actually better, or in a way that doesn't feel like the negatives are so obvious, and probably some ways where that can add to it. That this particular AI is aggressive to a fault, and so if he's on your team, then you have to kind of play around that. Or if he's on the enemy team, you also have to play around that. But you can sort of exploit that. But maybe he's got a more defensive buddy, and it's a team game or something. You can imagine ways where you can use that to set something up well. And I do worry a little bit about, like, I have this, I guess you could call it a consistency obsession where, like, I always want, if there's one thing in the game, like, I want to extrapolate that out into a pattern. I don't really like the idea of, like, oddball mechanics or things that, like, almost feel gimmicky where it only occurs at this one time and then it never occurs again. And so I think I overly relate that to the idea of something like, here's an enemy that's not very intelligent or something to that effect. But in a game that's more about, like, Apex, a game that's more about combat and has this, like, third person idea, and in that environment, it's very different because instead of conceptualizing every enemy, like you said, that any movement mechanics, right? The enemies are going to have some element of, or they can do the same things you can do in that respect, but they're going to have different move sets. They're going to have different attacks. Like in that realm, it's very different. Whereas you're not trying to design an enemy that has all of the same tools as the player does, or at least all of the same mechanics as the player does. Like obviously they're an AI that's running a different race than you, and an RTS is going to have different tools on, like, a micro level of, like, specifically what units they have, but they're going to have access to all the same mechanics. Whereas in this environment, that's not the case. So the roundabout question here is, how do you approach designing enemies that are meant to be more throwaway or expendable? Because from what I can tell, you've got a lot of, like, really deep move sets available for all of the units that you've talked about. I think the Voidhound, which seems to be, like, maybe I'm misreading it as an entry level unit because it's a unit that was, like, one of the first ones that you were working on years ago. But it feels to me like it's a unit that you're going to use a lot of, that you're going to see a lot of, and maybe is even going to be, like, almost iconic for the project. But it has this incredibly broad and deep move set where it can do so many different things, and you're still adding to it. And I think you said somewhere recently that it's not even done. There's going to be even more added to it. Where obviously most games just have, like, oh, here's the enemy and they have a heavy attack and then they have a ranged attack, or so, you know what I mean? Like, they don't really go too in depth in that. So how do you go about designing these enemies that are meant to be dumber or more aggressive or anything like that? And obviously, conversely, what kind of distinguishes it, besides maybe avoiding dangerous attacks that might launch them off ledges? What kind of things distinguish a smarter combatant like the Templar?
I think a lot about utility, but I also think a lot about their place in the world. So one of the new enemies that will be an Arbiter will be something that uses something sort of similar to the Templar's moveset, but is a lot less capable.
Okay.
More like, I kind of see them as, like, lower rank, like either conscripts, workers, generic soldiers or whatever. Because there has to be a variety of different Haladrian soldiers in that giant fortress, because it's quite huge now. But the way that I change them is they no longer have the lunge attack because they're using a hammer. So they don't thruster anymore. However, the properties of the similar attacks they have, the short swings, changes a lot. They're slower, but they deal more stagger damage on hit. And they have higher mobility. They use the step more often. And so now the way that they will interact with the fight will change a lot. They will be in all likelihood, a lot easier of an opponent because they're going to have less health. They're not wearing heavy armor. But if you run into there and you encounter a whole bunch of these different kinds of units at once, now the way that they behave turns into a synergy with each other. Because what ends up happening is the Templar end up taking the lead by lunging. And their close range engagement's also a lot more aggressive since they have that sequence stab attack. Whereas the other guys don't really have that. But they're going to be kind of like leapfrogging between each other, where some swings they're much faster, but they deal less stagger damage, which are coming out of the Templar's sword. And others may be a little bit slower and less often, but pack significantly more stagger damage instead, which will be the hammers. So now it becomes about paying attention to what each individual unit does. So when we have units that are like, these are units that are going to be worked on a lot. Like if we actually manage to ever get stable footing and we can continue to work on this beyond this point, those units, they both have a lot planned for them. Like one thing I'm not going to get in all likelihood is the defensive stance, because they have shields. I want them to be able to use them, but shields is a really kind of a prickly subject when it comes to these games, because anytime you bring up shields, they're universally done terribly. And we wanted our shields to be based on traces. And that's the other thing too. I forgot to mention that we want, hopefully can get in by then, is a trace system. I now have that plugin. I need to implement it. I need to learn how it works, and I need to transfer everything over to it, and then I need to thoroughly test it. So we'll be hopefully switching from overlaps to traces by that point. But that is a fairly major systems change, and I don't think it's very hard to work with, but I do have to actually compile everything and get it all working. So there is definitely a point to getting to the stage where I can have that in and actually try it, but it is something I want to get in. If we get that in, then we can start talking about shields, because we couldn't do the shields prior to that because the overlaps are too inaccurate. So usually in a lot of these games with shields, it's a very binary response. If I have a shield up, you can't deal damage to me. It goes for both the player and the enemies. And there's a lot of cases, like for example in Genshin Impact, which is a Chinese phone game. If these goblins have their shields up, they can kind of just block anything in the game, even with their assholes. You can have what is basically like a demigod wielding a sword that can split reality. A little goblin, first level goblin in the game with a wooden shield, can block it with his asshole. So there's a lot of shit like that in these games. And same with like God of War and stuff like that. And so then we get into cases, we gotta have special cases how to deal with our shields. Like in God of War, it's a QTE. And this is like, in some cases you can hit them from behind, but I think it's only melee can hit them from behind. And a lot of these things are like have ranged components that just for some reason can't hit them from behind. And you start getting these woodworks where it's like, we want the shields to be relevant, but now you need ways to deal with the shields, and you get into like heavy attacks, light attacks, and so my shields are just going to be, if you hit the shield, it only does stagger damage, and maybe it reduces the amount of stagger damage it takes or something like that. So it's just going to be very directly like what you see is what you get, as opposed to this has some special interaction that only this has. And I was thinking having stuff like a mana barrier where enemies can give themselves temporary health and stuff like this, and it's literally just, you can just keep attacking them and you're still effectively breaking the shield. So I have to get all the systems enabled for that. But that stuff, like that kind of stuff's very unlikely to be in. But, even like the simple enemies, like the simpler Hammer Templars still have shields. Mm-hmm. They're still trying to shield bash you, and they're still going to have a defensive stance. But how they use a defensive stance will also probably be different. Whereas the Templar may only switch to it after lunging, or they may have different behaviors, because one of the things I want to do that also probably won't make it in, but it's really not that hard to do. But once you have enough of these systems set up with the way the behaviors are in, you can actually randomize their AI personalities. So that was something I was going to do, where some personalities are more evasive, some are more aggressive, some make use of certain abilities more than others. And I can build these all off of scalars and enumerators that are just configured on runtime when the AI first initiates. So some Void Hounds may stick only to trying to range you and avoiding you. Some Void Hounds may always try to get in your face. Some Void Hounds may rely more on bombs. So those behavior changes, we don't even need to touch anything in the rest of the unit. It'll be just driven by numbers and crunching and stuff like that all is built into their existing behaviors. So that kind of thing is likely to make it in by December.
Would that be something that you would be interested in overriding depending on the rest of the map state? Like you could imagine a bomb-focused Void Hound as the melee ones or the more aggressive ones start to fall. Maybe he also switches or something like that. Or would you prefer that once the player starts to observe the behavior, that one just kind of stays the same? Because it's like a mix between this is a good mix of utility or like role assignment for the combat at hand versus this is like what that specific enemy is in a personal sense, right? So, or individual sense. How do you sort of square that?
That's going to be something I'm going to have to approach when I get there. But okay. Yes, having crowd awareness and ally awareness and stuff like that is important, since I also want Void Hounds to be able to empower each other with their ranged attacks. They'll absorb it as opposed to taking damage, and they can heal each other and stuff like that. So that's all stuff that I don't know how to do yet. I haven't even tried to get into that yet. I know it is possible, right? Because there are crowd management systems. So that is another bridge to cross, but definitely one we will get to. Since obviously, if we've already killed everything, there's not really too much point being super evasive anymore unless we're already hurting. And some enemies, some abilities will really only work best when there's allies around.
Sure, yeah.
So yeah, it'll be a context sensitive thing where specific enemies might change. Some enemies won't. They'll just do whatever. And then there, of course, something else I laid out when we first started talking about this 3 years ago. I mean, even before that, in initial concepts, is enemies that do learn what you do and what your tendencies are and adapt to it. So when you're talking about a system where we have 2 different damage types where one affects hit recovery and one doesn't, and certain attacks favor certain interactions, you're going to have people leaning towards certain kinds of playstyles and using certain kinds of abilities. Or just because of the way that the movesets work, especially since I don't have any control over the animations and I'm not an animator, there are going to be things that you can do that are just exploitative, and you can just keep doing them and they'll continue to be exploitative. So rather than try to make boilerplates that are just like, oh, you can't spam stun on this anymore, there's some special behavior with this unit because it doesn't work that well with this. I'd rather just have the AI learn what's going on and have the AI adapt to behavior tendencies to do certain things. So again, this is definitely a long-term thing, but like the more the player has success with certain things, especially in a boss fight in particular, which will be a lot longer, the AI will adapt to you doing certain things. So for example, a boss might not really input read you too much. It might just have its normal randomized or context-sensitive evasion, or it might just, step around and try to feint. But if you continually manage to break its stagger over and over and over again within a certain time frame, it may start switching to trying to read your movements. It might start switching to being more defensive. It may focus more on ranged attacks. It might try to put distance. Kind of like stuff like that, adaptive behavior. That's not really that difficult to do. AI that learns off of your tendencies is really not too difficult, because all you really need to do is you need to track what the player is doing input-wise and then track its success, which is its numbers. I'm not too good with numbers, but contextually it's not difficult to work off of, especially when you know everything that the player can do. So that's obviously not going to show up in December, but that is what we would do too. Is if the player is having success consistently with something, the AI should try to do something to counter that, which we can do by adjusting scalars, probably the same scalars that the other behaviors would adjust, is our tendency to read what you're doing, our tendency to react to what you're doing, our reaction times, and then our tendencies to rely on certain other kinds of behaviors. Where we might even stop trying to do behaviors entirely. Like if the player is always avoiding our ranged attacks, why bother using ranged attacks anymore? Let's just get straight into doing other stuff instead. So, absolutely, very much behavior driven in the sense that there's tendencies, but then there's also personality traits. We might even see the inverse too, where something has little success with something and they might just double down on it instead. So, again, very much dependent on what kind of units we're talking about. But I think there's several different layers to it, but it's really just like, what does common sense apply to this? There's nothing really elaborate behind any of this design. It's literally just, what does common sense say? You can look between 2 very low skill players just slapping each other, and they still try to adapt to each other, they still learn each other's tendencies, they still try different things, and then they still have behavior characteristics that define them, like, I always cannon rush the shit out of everybody, doesn't matter what the map distance is, right? Yeah. So, those defining attributes help us build personality, but those personalities do adapt. So, it's just, when with the Void Hounds, it's like, I'm not going to be able to have the rest of the units at the level of Void Hound because in order to give them their behaviors that they're going to need, I have to develop the systems for them, and I don't have the time, just plainly don't have the time to do that. So what we're going to have is either going to be similar to the Void Hound in some respects, like there's one enemy I'm going to have that has teleportation, and the way it teleports is fundamentally different than the Void Hound, but it's making use of the same data. That's going to be a very different interaction. But to get the kind of behaviors I wanted in, like I kind of wanted to give the Void Hound a pseudo stealth system, a shadow charge, and a whole bunch of other shit that's probably not going to make it in. But When I think about like say for example, there's going to be wolves because D&D wolves fall, everyone dies, and Dragon's Dogma wolves hunt in packs, which you're also going to experience. I just want there to be swarms of wolves in certain places. And wolves are very simple creatures. Now you can give them evades and lunge attacks and all this other stuff, but they're not going to have map control elements or whatever. How do you make them stand out and difficult? I just spawn like 1,000 of them. But then you got to have them actually be aggressive, which is really the big thing. And right now, I can't get fucking detour crowd pathing to work at all. Whenever I turn it on, the AI just doesn't move anymore, and I can't find any information about it whatsoever. Oh, yeah. So having large numbers of enemies doesn't work as well as it should. So hopefully, mysteriously, one day it'll just work. It broke when I introduced the agents, so yeah, the navigation system in Unreal is definitely one of the weakest parts of it, and it hasn't been updated in forever. They did implement mass entities, which are for like crowds and stuff like that, but they never have touched EQS or anything else since it was first implemented, and it's either a case of like the lighting system where they're secretly got someone working on it and they're going to just one day spring up a big update for it, or they just don't care because it's not in Fortnite. So there's definitely a lot of limitations I'm working with right now that are really holding me back. The smart links being really finicky is a big one. It taking a long time to link up maps is another. And then the detour crowd pathing not working is another. So what that would do is if I have like 69 wolves trying to swarm me in one spot, they'll navigate around each other. They'll avoid each other. Currently, they don't really do that. Now, there's something called RVO avoidance, which is, it sort of helps a little bit with that, but it's not really that reliable. You usually try to make use of both of them. And I had it working before, but I think it's just like it's incompatible with certain move functions. And why, I don't know, but I don't know. Anyways, we probably won't be looking at super huge unit numbers yet, but I have tested the game with about 200, 300 Void Hounds at once some years ago, and it worked perfectly fine. So I don't see why I can't do that here. And my AI was a lot less efficient back then than it was now, too. Back then, I was doing a lot of stuff on tick I shouldn't have been doing. Right. Nowadays, I've switched all that to interfaces, so it's way faster, way cleaner. Now it's more scalable as a result. So that's also like where a lot of my time has gone, is I try not to think about the future. The future is shit, and if I die or whatever, or if I'm homeless, then that's just whatever. But you can spend all the time getting stressed out about this stuff, which I have for most of my life, or you can just keep hammering and keep smashing. So there's a lot of modernization, of making stuff scalable, of optimization going on, that it doesn't amount to a lot right now because our context is very small. Having a few things running on tick in the AI controller is not going to make a big difference in the context of the real resource hogs like Lumen. But it's stuff that's like I need it done before I start copy pasting this 1,000 times for 1,000 different units, and I've got to change it for each and every single one. So there's just a lot of under the hood stuff that's been done. Void Hounds before, with those nav links, they used to jump between them. Now they teleport between them. And then that introduced a whole host of stuff I had to fix because the teleport doesn't really adjust their position very well. And if it thinks it can't go there, it will bail out of it. So I had to have fallbacks for it, where if it thinks they're too big to fit in a space, then it checks the nav mesh for a very large space. And if that isn't available, then it has another fallback. So that's all stuff that I didn't expect to run into, but had to develop. So, in the context of this demo, there's not going to be a lot of manifestation of that. But
it sounds to me like the process, right? The process for your development seems to be like you have this idea of stuff, and unfortunately, a lot of the stuff you're trying to implement is actually been done before or easily doable. And then there's a lot of stuff that like might be easy, but nobody's even fucking bothered. So yeah, it's hard to find information on the internet. And then like I don't know. It seems like you just you like you were saying this. You just keep smashing. You just keep doing the work, and then you get to a point where it's like, well, I need to figure out how to do this. Like, how do you if you can't teleport somewhere? What should you do? And then you research like how to do the fallback thing, and so it's like a series of and this is probably true of many projects, maybe all projects, but it's like a series of just that's a brick wall. Okay, now I have to figure out how to smash through it. Let me just think. Look up how to smash through this wall.
That's what development is. Problem solving is what it is. It is like that's been the case since I got into StarCraft. Is no information existed for StarCraft. Nothing existed. Since the very first time I got into StarCraft, I've been on my own, right? Other than like HKiss helping me out or whatever. And then that's his research. Like, it's just been either me or him. Just, that's why we're the pioneers, because there was no information. There was nobody else doing anything. When I got started in 1998 with mapping and stuff like that, and the AI and stuff like that, there's no information. When I was at my heights in 2003, 2004, there's no information. When I'm working in Armageddon Onslaught, there really has no information. Yeah. Most of the websites don't even exist anymore. And now today, you've got your resources, which none of that stuff existed back then.
Yeah.
Nothing even close to it. And the tool developers were all cunts and we're all useless, with the exception of Broodkiller, who was just largely useless. And
okay.
And like, and then, Warcraft 3, no information exists. Diablo 2, there are people who know stuff and are willing to share that information. I wasn't in contact with them back then. And then, I had all the issues with hard code that's what I didn't learn about 90% of that hard code until well after. Right. And then like Sins of a Solar Empire, again, uncharted territory. Like every single place I've gone, it's always just been uncharted territory, which led into the disdain for stuff like hard code and stuff like that, because so many times in so many games, I'd be like, I have a great idea. This should work in the context of this game.
Right.
You go into it and realize every single fucking thing is locked down in hard code. That's just like, you couldn't even begin to address it. And then it just, you discover that after so many weeks, months of research, and it's just, you go through that over and over and over and over and over and over and over, and you start to really hate the whole thing. With something like Unreal, you have access to the source code, so you can't just say, oh, it's hard-coded, I can't do that, but obviously there's limits to what you can do if your skills don't have it.
Yes, yeah.
So
the skills become the hard code, basically.
Yeah. And for me, that's art-related stuff. I can't do anything related to art at all. Most I can do is mangle stuff in Krita, and maybe adjust them in Blender or 3ds Max like I have with the Worgen model or whatever. But when it comes to the process of like, I need a wolf with an animations to handle our travel form, it has to have, directional movement, jumps, and all this other stuff. And I thought I had the resources for that, but I really didn't, because I couldn't make the IK retargeting and stuff work. And the official recommendation is to just hand it off to your animator and let your animator fix it.
Yeah.
Like, serious. Oh, God. We get started on the IK retargeting stuff. I could be rambling on that for like 2 or 3 hours. How fucking pissed off it makes me, man.
I feel like the bulk of the like paragraphs that were posted recently were about that in some way, shape, or form. Just like epic lists of fucking like, so you can do this and then it doesn't work, and then they tell you to do this and then that doesn't work, and then we found like some obscure development log where they talked about like they sort of spoke in coded language about what you might be supposed to do or something, and that was like that's how you figured out, I think, that you could do it with bigger proportions but not smaller ones or something.
So like, I've pulled information from all sorts of strange places. So Epic has most of Epic's useful material in terms of education information is actually in live streams. And
just like the fucking least useful resources.
Yeah, and they're not labeled in a useful way. So the analyzing Lyra animations, which Lyra is their new shooter demo, a new code-based demo for, templates and stuff like that. That has the most information that anybody's posted for fucking IK retargeting in it. And I hear you snorting cocaine, trying to get your day started.
No, I was blowing my nose, bro.
Oh, that sounded like snorting up cocaine. So that has like the most of information. But then there's like this other random person where all their videos have like 10 views, and all their comments are all disabled, just like mine are. But they're like, when you research them, they seem like really, I don't know, like one of their co-workers on their little project they have, the tags they use for the video is vegan. So I have like there's like red flags everywhere about autism.
Vegan. Okay.
But then in like the one video they have, it's like, by the way, to fix root motion and IK retargeting, you gotta set these things to globally scaled. That fixes all the retargeting issues with root motion. Like, just out of nowhere, this random nobody on the internet with their project about dancing that has no views and it appears to just be another private project like mine is, has this video that has information I've literally found nowhere else on the entire internet. That's one key to the puzzle to fixing that piece of shit. The other one was from a French guy who is a licensed, or at least an authorized Unreal educator. I don't know what that even means, but he has another IK retargeting video, and he talks about the I guess I can't really pull it up here without waiting a while, but it's like the stiffness and the constraints and stuff for the limbs and the actual retargeting. This is not mentioned in the slightest in the Lyra video or anything else anywhere that I have found so far. And that's just another little piece of the puzzle that helps you a little bit in fixing like the pelvis rotating when it shouldn't be, and the shoulders and stuff rotating when they shouldn't be. And it's just like all these little things just kind of add up where you finally start getting a picture of how this piece of software is actually supposed to work. And as a result, that's one of the things I am going to hopefully have. I mean, I have it demonstrable. It's just not finished enough for December. Is one of these models I could not retarget in Unreal 4 is now retargeted in Unreal 5. And I don't know about two-handed animations or other really precise stuff, but it has irregular legs. Those work. And the arm lengths are longer and those work. And it works pretty much, as far as I can have tested so far, at least within like 80-90% accuracy with Frank's mage animations. So that's a really big thing. That was massive, because up until that point, I've been basically having no success with the retargeting whatsoever. Shorter limbs is still beyond our grasp. I actually got in contact with the author of some of the assets I was talking about in that demo, and I was talking to her for a while, and she was like, "Oh yeah, IK and retargeting is everything's a damn mess." And it's like completely different than the marketing material. It's like, "Oh yeah, it just works on the mannequin skeleton," but that's because Epic's guidelines in the marketplace are so fucking unenforced and loose that, you know, as far as those guidelines are concerned, if the bones are named the same and the hierarchy is the same, it's a mannequin skeleton. There is no forewarning about the absolute fucking massive disaster that awaits below the surface when you actually get into this. And she's like, "Oh yeah, I had endless headaches trying to get this one mannequin animation to work for my demo." And no real progress there. But I also contacted that French guy too, and he's like, yeah, all those are a disaster. You're probably gonna need to get into Control Rig to try to fix the hands and at least line them up. So Control Rig is another thing that came with Unreal 5, and that's like full body IK manipulation on runtime, and it looks really neat and it sounds really cool, and you can supposedly use it to tidy up animations. It's probably the most complicated thing they've added to the engine yet, and it changes all the time, and documentation on it, what little exists, is going to be out of date. So like even the IK retargeter that I was using was completely different than everything else everyone else is using, because I'm on an internal dev build of 5.1. Everybody else is just using the early 5.0 versions. So, you know, that's kind of part of the problem. Then. Yeah, well, it's part of the problem with dealing with cutting edge software is what little bit exists is going to be out of date. But it's also like the old IK or the old retargeting, there's the information out today is still completely fucking useless. There was one random video, I think from a Korean, who knows, maybe from Black Dream or one of his cohorts, and their way, like when you do retargeting, you have this thing called a rest pose, which is supposed to tell the bones, like, you try to get these different proportion models and their arms and fingers and all their things to be kind of lined up. So the bone data is at least sort of similar. And the way that they did that as opposed to fucking with the rest pose is they just set all the transforms to 0. So everything is just like, just this flat, like all the bodies just completely messed up, just flat on the ground. And that's how you retargeted between the mannequin and the Paragon asset. And I did that, and it gave me a better retarget than any of the fucking with the normal rest poses does. Why does that work? Because all the transforms are 0. So they're as close as they're really going to get, because you're no longer trying to interpolate between some different transform and another different transform. Just set them all to 0. Why have I never even heard about that anywhere else? So I don't know if that works for the IK retargeter, but it definitely worked with a regular retargeter, and I had never even seen it mentioned anywhere else, just in some random guy's video about Paragon retargeting. And yeah, when it comes to like the travel form and stuff like that, it's like the only person I can really ask is Ace Case. It's like, how would I do this? Should I use a different character blueprint? Should I do what? And he says, well, you probably should just use the same blueprint so that you can keep all your existing inputs and all this other stuff. You look on the internet for transforms and morphing and stuff like that. You get people talking about just like changing the model and then that's it. And then, like maybe like spawning a different actor or something. Like it's in part because search engines are so fucked and have been for years now, because it's all like algorithm driven shit that it tries to think it knows what you want as opposed to just searching verbatim. And when you search verbatim, everything else is still driven by these algorithms, and it's so hard to find anything at all. And it's also that, most of the information is from hobbyists or people who are just not very good at educating in general, honestly. And I know someone would mention, well, why don't you make some tutorials then? Well, if I had time, I might have done some rundowns for some of my stuff, but I don't think we're going to be able to, at least not for a long time.
Yeah, so I can speak on that point a little bit, because when you were talking about how a lot of the StarCraft documentation didn't exist or whatever, it's like I've made now on multiple different websites between the Wikidot and the actual Frauds Club website. I've got loads of documentation, and most people don't even read the installation guide, let alone get past that step. And
yeah, I've seen that.
Then they'll ask questions, or they'll waste my time in some other way when like the resources are plainly available and linked in the spots that their initial contact point is. Like, there's a recent one where somebody was trying to play a mod that they found on my channel, and then they were like, I followed this link, but it didn't work. What do I do? And it's like, well, how am I supposed to help you with that kind of information?
Oh yeah, I see a lot of that shit. I see that in comments for tutorial videos.
Yeah.
I see shit like that. That's like, just watch the fucking video, man.
Yeah. So my point there is just, when you look at the legacy of that documentation, when you look at the legacy of the tutorials and the instructions and the getting started and even the philosophy, like here's some thoughts about map design or AI design or whatever, it's like the end result of all of that is not that there has been an influx of, at least, maybe there's a lot of private projects that benefited from that, and I'm just not aware of them, but as far as I can see, there's been exactly zero projects other than those within this exact community, like when iQueer was still around and he was still working on stuff, and obviously CMBW itself, it's like there's zero projects from people who are not directly working on maps within Cosmonic Brood War itself that have benefited from this documentation, or that have rather taken advantage of it. It's like the other projects don't even have mods in them, so obviously they're not following any of the documentation.
Well, that's because modding is dead.
Yeah, so and
it has been there was a reason why I was on my own, is because I was literally the only person doing anything.
And I think the if you want to take a lesson from that phenomenon, it's probably that there's you kind of need to. The people who are serious about working on projects are going to embed themselves within a community that is also serious about that. And so that's why you see that the only people who are still even, following the documentation and asking questions about it, that are not just why doesn't it work with no context, are the people who are already in the server, already talking about, the work that they're doing, or reporting any issues that they might find with the stuff. Like recently, there's a guy on the server, the Beaver, who was working on a 1v1 map in Cosmonic Brood War, and he like sent me, oh, I found some bugs here, and I was like, okay, cool, yeah, I fixed those. Like those are the kinds of people who are actually going to look at the documentation, and who did look at the documentation, and then watch the videos and whatever else. Those are the kinds of people who are like, they've got skin in the game, and they're not going to just waste your time with like stupid comments that
they are 1 in a million.
Yeah. So
no matter the game, like it doesn't matter if StarCraft's old, they are 1 in a million.
It's very rare to find somebody who's actually going to do stuff like that. But when you do, the plus side is like that does create a culture of taking the whole idea seriously. And now, great. It's like, you're not gonna waste my time. And so, yeah, I would say I used to, push the educator role a lot more, especially around like specific technical things like the Brood War modding or whatever. Now it's just, for one, our tools are changing. For another, we're moving on pretty soon. And thirdly, because like the people again who are actually serious about it will prove it by sticking around long enough to learn a thing or two just by watching or actually looking at the content, and then only asking questions after they've read the manual, so to speak. And just so few people actually do that I can easily filter those people out. Right, they're probably not too serious about their work if they're not even going to get past the initial step. Right, and I'm not saying that to absolve responsibility of maybe like I could have written the documentation better, I could have made the guide more informative, or I could have done a better job educating or whatever, but it's not even worth investing the time into in a like public for anybody who clicks on the video sense, because the whole idea there is that like I'm trying to provide a general solution for a very specialized problem, which is not going to work. Like you kind of need to just immerse yourself in it. So I would say, I mean, like it's a little bit different in the Unreal case because there's such a bigger user base. But despite that, or maybe because of that in some way, you don't get too many people who are that concerned about like animations literally not making contact with the fucking walls and stuff. So like the reason why you don't see this documentation anywhere is probably because people don't care about the animations working. So
absolutely. It's when I see a review of somebody on the marketplace that says, oh, this retargets perfectly.
Yep.
With no examples, or their examples really. There was one for one of the other demon assets I have, and they're like, "Hey, we got this to work great in our game," and they shows a demo video, and oh my god,
and it doesn't.
Oh my god, his idea of retargeting animations was like, I don't think it was even really an animation. I think it was like he just used a pivot on the arms to just like attach them to something and point them in a direction. It was so fucked. And like that was a project that I think it's on Steam right now. Like,
yeah, probably got money for it.
It's bad enough when you're like reviewing these games and they're fucking disasters, like Doom, for example. And then, but of course, in the development side, when you have people who aren't filled with people who at least at some point were educated on this subject. It is definitely so much worse. And education in general is a really big subject. I've obviously educated a lot of people over the years and tried to assimilate information as well. And with Unreal, it's kind of an extreme case because it's such a massive system. The whole thing of building a game from scratch, even if you're not dealing with the low-level stuff, it's still massive because when you go with an Unreal, it's not like a mod. You don't have an existing, you might use a template like Lyra or Shooter Demo or a third person. That really is not a huge starting point. Maybe Lyra has more game systems in it than the others did. Maybe that's why they revised it. But from what I saw, it's still like you got to make your own literally everything beyond just the internet. Like when I started, what I had was the Paragon assets, which had their attack system was just, it had no collision data, no damage, anything, no vitals. It was just literally you push a button and it cycles between animations, and that's it. And that was my starting point. That was literally everything else I have from that point was built completely from scratch. And when you look for educational material on this, I have learning disabilities in general, so for me, it's really hard to assimilate information. But I actually find like written and video tutorials largely useless for the most part, because usually it's like the way that I do things is very hands-on. The way that I educate is very hands-on. My way of usually figuring out how stuff works is by tearing things down, is by taking something and breaking it apart and then seeing how it works. I'm a run and gun developer in both respects, where I can't really sit down and watch something for 15, 20 minutes. I prefer to be actually working on it. So when I watch a video, it's usually like I jump to a point and I just like read what's on their screen. I just start copy pasting. And then I try to go from there without even watching the rest of it. Except for certain cases where I'm trying to, like, if it's something like the French guy, where I was trying to figure out what little bit of details he knew that I didn't.
Right.
But then it's like, for me, it's much better to have that person on hand. Like, HKS has been pretty much my mentor for all this programmatic stuff. And he's not, when we started that, his programmatic, like, he got into it with Unreal and stuff like that. He wasn't with a programmer background. Like, I think Veek probably has some kind of programmer background before he got into StarCraft, because it's pretty obvious that he knows low-level stuff. And then the guy I talked to with Diablo 2 and stuff like that, he's a programmer. All the people he talked to are programmers. They're like well beyond professional level. So they had all this history coming into here. And but even then, even if HKS wasn't able to answer all my questions or didn't know everything, just having him on hand to just grill constantly for really stupid things, because I get hung up on the dumbest shit all the time. And like I when I was setting up the travel form, and I needed to be able to switch what your inputs actually do between the two, because the way they turn is different. That was based on the Boolean, and I spent, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours trying to figure out why it wasn't fucking doing anything I was trying to tell it to do. It's because I didn't even read the Boolean switch. I never even checked it. So I'm trying to read something from data that's never actually going to change. I never even thought to think about that. So I always get hung up on the dumbest shit. And that's just, I mean, a part is being distracted, but it's also in part because I think that the way that my brain just processes this information is I tend to glaze over simple things really easily, and I tend to overcomplicate simple things. So having him on hand to ask how I would do this or that has saved me, I mean, probably like over half the project's time span of working on it is just time saved by that. And you can't do that with somebody who uses Patreon, who uses YouTube subscription, all these people trying to make fucking money off of this shit. It's not altruism, it's greed. And the vast majority of these people are disinclined to engage with you as a result of that, because they're not going to make money. They're not going to drive you to their Patreon if they'll just answer your questions in a comment on YouTube, right? Like, they're disinclined to do that, even if they normally would have been helpful individuals. And then, of course, you have the translation barrier of, this isn't StarCraft. In StarCraft, there's a right way to do every single thing within StarCraft. There's a right way to make your project, to make your writing, to implement it at the technical level, because there is only 1 or 2 ways you can do anything in it. Within Unreal, the attack system, like dozens of different ways you could do that. So you have a translations barrier between how somebody might implement something and then how you might implement it, and then another layer of how you might interpret their implementation. So it's like talking to somebody who is Chinese through fucking Google Translate back and forth using Indonesian as a middleman. And you have to kind of just infer what's going on a lot of the time. And that makes the whole education process even more complicated than it already would be.
Right.
Because what I'm finding as I go through this, as I start learning more and more and more about programming and understanding basic stuff, is holy fuck, people have terrible practice everywhere. Like, you guys complain a lot about object-oriented. But to me, just in the realm of object-oriented, and just in the realm of just like fucking common sense, there's already a lot to scrape through and just laugh at. Like, the most prominent locomotion system that everybody uses because it was free was ALS. And ALS has sleep everywhere on tick and on actions And yes, that does hang up the entire fucking thing. There is so much shit on tick that just shouldn't be. The general layout of it is just absolutely fucking maddening. And I was having so many issues with this fucking travel form not moving in the direction I was telling it to move. Like, it wouldn't orient to your direction. Now, normally the character is using 8-way movement and strafing. The travel form is a wolf. It's not going to strafe. And I needed it to switch. So I'm telling all the basic fucking functions to switch to orient to movement, and it's not fucking working because the ALS parent is doing its own special needs shit that for some reason is overriding all this. Okay, great. Once I figured that out after some hours of banging my head into it and realizing this is probably an ALS issue, even though I'm bypassing all of its inputs and everything related anyways, it's still fucking with it, I'll just change ALS's rotation mode. When I switch back, it's fucked because it's not resetting all the fucking values back to what they once were. So now I have to manually set those fucking values too, even though this isn't supposed to be governing it to begin with. Like, God, man. Nowhere, of course, this totally undocumented. And the guy was hired by Epic and just wrote that off as like, I'm never going to update this ever again. I'm never going to clarify or answer any questions ever again. Get fucked. Everybody uses it because it's free. It's a fucking trap. And traps are gay.
I was waiting for it. I'm always shocked when I hear that, like, I shouldn't be, because like you said, it's like
getting stuck in Star Edit for a really long time.
Yeah.
But when you're using Star Edit, you can no longer open it in SEM draft. That's the equivalency of what's happened. And you've made your whole campaign in Star Edit, and now you realize you want to make an actual project, and now you have to start all over again. That is kind of like what ALS is like.
Well, it's also the abbreviation, the acronym for some degenerative disease, so I guess that's appropriate.
It is. You know, that also makes finding information on it very hard, by the way.
Here's some information on ALS. You're fucked.
Yeah, it's like, no, this is not really what I want.
Yeah. So
it's what I feel like I'm getting by dealing with it, but it's not what I want.
Yeah. Well, sometimes when you name stuff, you got to be careful with the energy you put out into the world, because you'll name something and it'll have an acronym with something else or whatever, and then suddenly, surprisingly, it's actually really fucked up and should be improved. Well, I don't know, man. The memes that are bad programming ethics and the results therein are actually like. I was really surprised to hear that after Veek tried both Unreal and Unity for some sort of, I think it was a job application or something. He came away saying that Unity was significantly superior in the programming department, although still terrible, but still a generalized solution to a specific problem, which is always going to be bad. You're always leaving performance on the table, and obviously like flexibility is, ideal for some things, but it really only, like, I think if you don't, if you're not really heavily customizing something towards a specific end result, like a generalized solution works for a generic product, maybe, you know what I mean? Like it's not gonna provide you, you're not providing yourself with the tools necessary to complete a more specific vision. And so I think you're kind of, this might be overly reductive, I guess, but it feels like you're boxed into a corner. Like you gave the Star Edit versus SEM draft example, which will be more familiar for Brood War people. It's like, if you can only use Star Edit, if your tool can only do certain things, then there's going to be some things you can't ever do, like, actually build a product like you were saying. So yeah, it's just, it does seem a bit wild to me that like the defaults or the free stuff in Unreal is so dreadful. And I don't know about Unity if it's better in that department, but apparently in the programming department and in if you're actually trying to write code, Unity is a significant step up relative to Unreal because of the fact that Unreal is so heavily object-oriented and apparently also just like that's going to instantiate so many issues down the line. You're going to have so many bugs that are just because like you forgot something or you can't hold the whole system in your head because it's super complicated. And then on top of it, it's like, I mean, I know the way that you're mostly interfacing with a lot of what would be code, in maybe Unreal 3 or something is the blueprint system. And,
Well, blueprints only existed in Unreal 4. You're using Unreal Script. And actually, it is right. Worth jumping into this and mentioning a few things. First of all, they're bringing back Unreal Script. So I think Unreal is a victim of its own success because earlier in Unreal's lifespan, it was just an engine, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it probably was a lot cleaner back then. But then Epic transitioned away from it. I think it was in part because their leadership is all incompetent morons. And then you had the whole, we're going to just focus on consoles because consoles are the end thing. And they abandoned Unreal Tournament and they went to Gears of War. And Unreal kind of sat in like the UDK, and then the UDK came out. And then the UK was super popular, and they realized, wait a second, the indie scene is kind of a thing. Other developers are more likely to get in if they have something they can jump into. And then Unity, I think, I'm not really familiar with Unity's history, so maybe I'm very wrong. But I think Unity started as just being a game engine that they sell, and they didn't make any core products with it. The biggest issue with Unreal 4 is that it is governed by Fortnite. And Fortnite was going to be a game about crafting survival horror, and then it became a battle royale because battle royales were popular. And then a lot of what made Fortnite stand out either went in the backdrop or disappeared. But then Fortnite became something they had to focus on because that was what was keeping their company afloat, because other than the licenses and stuff like that from the UDK and stuff like that, they didn't have success anymore because Gears of War was static. And Unreal Tournament, I will never understand the whole crowdsource development Unreal Tournament thing. Obviously, they didn't understand either because they canned it, but it was destined to fail from the start. And all they had to do was just make Unreal Tournament. But it was very obvious all their development energy went into Fortnite. Now, the problem circulating a lot of this is there are really not a lot of people out there who are skilled enough to do stuff like make Unreal Engine. There's not a lot. So a lot of what comes out in terms of major feature advancement is from papers that companies publish for certain systems, like, let's say, for example, PBR. And then that gets implemented, and then that gets adopted by everybody else. And there's not really a lot of people that are capable of making these systems. So not only do you get kind of locked into them when you adopt them, because the industry advances to a point where people as consumers just kind of expect this stuff like 3D, and you just kind of have to sort of advance it if you want it to continue to be successful. But it's also very expensive, because these people know that they are in demand and they're going to charge an arm and a leg, and the positions become extremely costly. But it's also that you only have so many people who can do this stuff. So Epic ends up having their engine, which they've released as Unreal 4, being driven by Fortnite because that's where all the development goes. So that's why the AI is in such a sorry state, is because the AI is actually a third-party system called Recast. And I know they customize it to some extent. I don't know about how much, but you have third-party solutions. Look, again, I mentioned Kythera. Kythera was one I was looking at because it sounded very neat. Kythera exists for, I believe, Unity, Unreal, and some others. And they have stuff like automatic markup for nav links and stuff like that. And it sounds really neat. Obviously, it's something you require a license for. So, but when you have studios that just take these third-party solutions, then Epic is like, well, why bother making our own solution? But there are cases where they're like, we want the solution, so they end up implementing it. Now, what ends up happening is when Epic adopts something or it becomes free, like ALS, is that kind of becomes their problem now, which means they have to maintain it. So if they decide to take something into the engine and they have to maintain it. So right now, one of the big ones is animation compression. So Epic's default animation compression is okay, but there exists a third-party animation compression system that's been out for a while that it's like 1,000 times better. It's way faster. HKS was having me implement that, and as I'm asking him, so why doesn't Epic just take this and put it in their engine? And he says, well, it's because if they take it and put it in their engine, now it's their thing to maintain on top of it. And that's on top of everything else. So the problem with Unreal is because it just grew. Like when it hit Unreal 4, it just exploded in size. And then source code became available to everybody. And now it's become a behemoth that everybody is now trying to access and do stuff with that the Fortnite team doesn't do anything with. And as a result, they now have to split their development up. And then when they do take in certain things, like say, for example, Quixel or MetaHuman or stuff like that, now they have to maintain all that on top of it. So I think part of the problem is that it just became too large for them to handle. Whereas Unity is very closed, very small in comparison, and very locked down, especially to the end user. You have to have a license to access a lot of it, and it's making more money off of telemetry because it's full of telemetry and shit like that on top of it. So, it's really gross in that respect, but it's also like that's also where part of their support is coming from. And the fact they're not taking a game that they're making and then forking stuff off of it and making the engine afterwards. So Unreal absolutely has a lot of problems in that regard. And I don't know about the programmatic scene for Unity. I just know that any Unity game can be reverse engineered to source because net can be decompiled to source. And that should make anybody who would ever actually seriously consider making products for that just make them run screaming, because you can't even begin to apply security to it. That's why there are reps of every phone game in existence. That's why all this shit gets data mined for stuff like Genshin Impact, and why it's impossible to keep anything down, because if the data exists, you can get it, and that's that. And beyond that, I don't know about the quality of its code or anything like that. I can tell you that every Unity game I've ever seen performs like absolute shit. So regardless of the quality of the actual engine in itself, of how it's built or how it's presented, all the end products that come out of it are universally shit. I have never seen a single exception. So, I mean, Unreal, I'm not going to defend them and say, oh, well, Unreal's the exception to that. No, I mean, Unreal can perform well, and I think I managed to make it perform well given the state it's in, but it's definitely a long ways to go for that too. So, but it's also like, I think it's just worth bringing up when you're mentioning about that, when Veek said, is that Unreal has a very different history behind it, and I think that contributes a lot to its current state. And I think that Epic acknowledges a lot of that, because they're trying to like deprecate old stuff. Like one of the things HKS is telling me about is that they're going to finally start getting to is changing how assets are loaded and resources are loaded in the editor. Because right now you have this really dumb behavior where if I want to rename something or delete something, it has to load it first when I click on it. And that makes no sense at all. And that's as a result of something very old, where it was an optimization attempt or something like that. That's finally getting changed, so it's no longer going to do that. But along with that, they're basically overhauling the entire way the editor loads resources so that it can handle projects like mine a lot better. So they try not to like reach halfway points. They try to make actual solutions to these issues. And then again, because of limited resources and time, stuff like that, it doesn't happen. So you're kind of like sitting in the midway point where Unreal has... One of the main complaints I see about Unreal is that the entry barrier is really high for it. I don't think that's the case whatsoever. I think it's too low. But
yeah, judging by what we're seeing on a
daily basis. I mean, I'd say the same for Unity too. I don't think anybody should just be able to jump in and make a game. It's still like, once you get in, it's very easy to get in, but the curve turns into a vertical cliff once you get past that entry barrier, is the problem. And that like, people aren't inclined to ascend that. And I can't speak from the programmatic point, because I just work with blueprints, and they're just like babies first, introduction to numbers. But we already have source level changes. We maintain a source build for this. So at least with Unreal, you can do that, right? Like, you can't do that with Unity. I don't think you can access the source code outside of a license. And that's just, telemetry. Like, why would you even run something with telemetry, especially when you don't even know what it's doing, and the average end user doesn't have access to... Like, honestly, Unreal completely changed the way that I view content building. Like, I don't think I could ever go back to modding at all, because the thought of having, especially today in 2020, where we have so much crypto bullshit and telemetry and crap everywhere, I couldn't ever justify downloading a program off of the internet from somebody I don't know and running it. I couldn't begin to do that, especially when, you have like countries like Canada and Germany that are so anti-speech and everything's a fucking honeypot everywhere. You have to be so careful about what you're doing on your computer now. To just be downloading random programs from Joe's Sixpack, at the very least, you've got to run it in a fucking virtual machine and track its network usage and all this other shit. You didn't have to worry about that back then because there really wasn't much skin in the game. But now with Unreal, where you always have source access, you want to know what something does and you have the skills to dig it up, you just dig it up. And you can see precisely what's going on. You can't do that with most software, and most people in modding cling to their fucking source code down to the bitter ends, even though they gain absolutely nothing from it. And I know you guys have a lot of issues with that, even to present day, because of SEM draft. And it doesn't make any sense, even if that's not the case of it being like, oh, we're worried about the quality of our code or whatever. It just makes no sense to deny access to that to people trying to make content.
That's the thing, is like that's probably one of the biggest faults in the current pipeline of like working on content for Cosmonarchy Brood War, is the fact that we have to manually place every extended tile. We have to, if you want to place an extended unit, you have to place a unit that does exist and then manually type in the new unit ID, which defaults it to a Marine, and then thus doesn't actually occupy like a building space grid. So what you have to do is you have to find a building that has the same dimensions as the extended building you're trying to place, and then or maybe there's not something that has those dimensions, so you just have to like guess or something if you want it actually aligned on the grid. You know what I mean? Like that's like an example of something egregious. There's also, there are other things too, like the trigger system doesn't take into account extended units. If you add like any of the extended data files in, it just crashes on startup, because the whole point, like the way that the software is written, is not to take the length of the data file, which would obviously solve all these issues. It's hard coded to assume the default limits. So like it's not even reading the unit stat length. And so if it's something that it doesn't expect, it just explodes.
I mean, on one hand, you can kind of understand that because it was built in an age where this kind of stuff was unimaginable.
Yeah.
But,
But, like, this is the point. I'm not even criticizing that decision. Yeah, I'm not criticizing that decision. I'm just saying, like, if you didn't build it with a scalability in mind, and then scalability is achieved later, like, you're still alive, like you're still kicking, you still have access to your computer. And if you refuse to even push updates to the game, to the editor that you made like 2 years ago, you're still not even going to distribute those. Like, at least just hand it off. Hand the keys to somebody who will actually do stuff. Like, the things that we would do to this editor if we had the ability to was just boggles the mind that it's not possible right now. So I don't know. Like that's an egregious case. And so I can definitely relate to what you're saying is like, why would you come back to modding? Like, why would you come back to a closed source environment? Like I could imagine you maybe going to like one of the games that has source ports like Doom or whatever. But I mean, even then you're still dealing with the limitations of the architecture of that software. And, it's, maybe it doesn't actually facilitate what you want. Like I've thought about modding Doom because of how much better it is ostensibly to work with. But like, what would I even use? Like, well, I don't want to build a retro FPS necessarily. And that seems obviously, geared towards that. And just because we have the source code doesn't mean it's a good idea to like completely repurpose something. Because again, that's the trap of like going into one of these pre-made engines that's meant to be, generalized or whatever. It's like, if you don't have a vision of how you can get from wherever the starting point is to your end point, and you also like, I mean, in your case, it's impossible to know what that path looks like, right? But you're sticking to it and you're like grinding it out and you're dealing with that as a consequence. Like, you wouldn't want to stack on top of that, like, oh yeah, we don't have source access, oh yeah, we have fucked up editor, like, why would you ever come back? So yeah, definitely see your point there. Like, that's one of the main things that is compelling about us moving away is the idea that we're not going to be, we can place our tiles any way we want in Antikythera. We can place any kinds of any unit, any unit in the game. Can you imagine being able to place any unit? That's crazy. That's a privilege.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right, I gotta go AFK for a minute.
Sure. So after a little bit of cooking, we're back. And Mesk, I wanted to ask you, of course, about games like Apex, which is kind of weird because I'm imagining not too many games are going to be like Apex, but the games that were related to it that I've been told to check out or that I've been inspired to check out based on your commentary of them. I, of course, watched your playthroughs of Devil May Cry, the various games, including the one of the more recent ones, the DMC, which is a disaster. And I also have watched I haven't watched Dragon's Dogma, but I'm going to play Dragon's Dogma. And of course, you've talked about it just in the previous episode. You talked about its art direction and some of the stuff that you took from it. So basically, the question here, as we shift into the final legs of this episode, what is similar or something to the effect of like relatable to these games, and what about these games did you feel had the most potential? Because and this is a pretty big conversation topic, of course, but I guess we can start with some of the earlier games, which you said, I think you've said before, that God of War basically like was a dumbed down version of Devil May Cry that also featured QTEs instead of actual gameplay. But I know you have a lot of experience with that game franchise as well. Maybe you can speak a little bit to basically what you took from these earlier titles specifically, like the God of Wars and the Devil May Cries and stuff, the older ones.
So with God of War, I think it really stands the test of time is the aesthetic and the levels.
Okay.
The environments look pretty decent, especially in God of War 2, God of War 3. When I think about those, I think about the Greek architecture and, you know, it was a breakaway from a lot of the similar titles and a lot of the titles that come afterwards. The feeling of having more like elegance is the way I would describe it, more elegance in the environment and stuff like that. Nothing really for the gameplay for God of War really stands out other than mashing buttons to open doors and boxes becoming the staple by which games would follow for years to come.
Yeah.
With Devil May Cry, it was really, I guess, in the first game that really stood out is the fact that some enemies will navigate ledges, because that pretty much never happens in any game to come after, especially in the ARPGs. But even most shooters, like in Dumb Eternal, they have nav links. Some enemies will navigate ledges in some places, but only in specific places. In DMC1, all the way back, is that. And also, DMC1, also, too, the aesthetic and the level design was more interesting because it was a retooled Resident Evil. And the environment kind of reflected that, and having some non-linearity, some more explorative elements, and at least in the first half of the game. And also, as a result of that, the mood of that was really different than the later titles, which became very linear. And that was something I tried to, obviously, would try to replicate from that. And that kind of goes into Dragon's Dogma 2. So Dragon's Dogma is basically, it's very similar to Monster Hunter in some ways, and Monster Hunter is a really shitty ARPG franchise that's most well known for having fights that are basically 50 minutes of slapping a wall of health. And that definitely translates to Dragon's Dogma in many respects, particularly because of the pawns. So the pawns are a double-edged blade in Dragon's Dogma. They are both the most distinct and defining elements of the game, and when they work, it's quite fascinating because it's a party-based game. Now you can go through the game solo too, if you want to try that as an assassin or whatever. Then that is possible. It will expose a lot of very broken shit in that game. The AI completely shuts down in many cases when you don't have pawns active. As some of the videos I've put in Red Pill Roundup demonstrates from the Swedishman who sent me them. And when pawns don't work, which is pretty much the entirety of Bitter Black Island, because they didn't hook up any of the navigation or AI calls for any of the pawns within that entire area, Itsuno's area, they drag down the game a lot. So the whole premise of Dragon's Dogma is basically single-player party-based combat. And it does this in real time. And everything from the way the spells work to the way that the pawns work in concept is quite interesting. But in practice, they're terrible. So without knowing how much of a deep dive we really plan to get into that game, there's a lot of pitfalls that are not very obvious. Like spamming commands to pawns changes their inclinations, and the inclinations can seriously fuck up everything from their pathing to their ability usage. And there are many classes for the pawns that they just can't use at all, and classes that they can use but are fucking busted, and they don't know how to play whatsoever. There are classes in that game that are just flat out incomplete and only have like half the abilities of the other ones. The warrior comes to mind. And other classes are just flat out busted. I forget what abilities the Swedishman told me they discovered were completely busted, but Brain Splitter or whatever it is definitely one of the most busted ones, especially in the hands of the pawns. So the other thing that Dragon's Dogma has is a climbing system, which is a gimmick. And it's a complete gimmick. It is jank as fuck, awkward to control, and pawns are very inclined to grab a hold of something and climb onto it, even if you have unequipped their melee weapon with the intent of trying to get them to use their fucking ranged weapon, and they just will refuse to. So that was a very common issue. And suffice to say, the pawn system needed a lot of time and energy devoted into it. But Itsuno was much more interested in putting in QTEs and grinds. So the first half of Dragon's Dogma, all the way up until you complete the main story, it's at least demonstrable. And again, the aesthetic and the consistency of the world environment and stuff like that is pretty good. But the second you start hitting like Bitter Black, the game quality and all of its many flaws that may have been only partially visible at that point, or that you may have made note of, will become so much worse. So much worse. Everfall is also really bad too. Both of those areas are just garbage. They're complete garbage. And for any normal person, I would say just skip those because they add absolutely nothing to the game whatsoever. Which is a shame because they are unique areas in some senses. It's just the execution is horrendous. Dragon's Dogma is a very interesting study case in many respects. And many of those respects, it's like the potential that was there, especially with the pawn system and how it was squandered, is just so absolutely incredible. And it really, like, you got to hand off to Capcom how much they can repeatedly shit on franchises and take a golden egg and turn it into absolute diarrhea. They have a talent for that really only the likes of like Blizzard and Bethesda can surpass. It's really quite incredible. And you would see that again with Devil May Cry 5 as well. It's just how you could take something that is so hard to fuck up and you just fuck it up in ways that you couldn't have even imagined to be possible unless it's just plain and simple malice. In Dragon's Dogma, however, there is clear and evident interest from individuals of their team that you can see that you may not even get certain references to. One of the main or one of the side characters, I don't know if she's supposed to be black or if she's supposed to be some other nationality, but she is actually modeled off of one of the characters from Berserk, and her voice actor is really good. And there's actually a lot of very solid voice acting within Dragon's Dogma all the way up until the end of the vanilla campaign. And like Grigori is also another standout one. And in general, like the sound design's fairly solid and the visuals are very solid. The particle effects really stand out. But one thing you're not going to experience is how bad the performance was on the PS3. In the PS3, the performance was pretty horrible. I think it was like overdraw and the particles and stuff like that would just cripple the console completely. And but I really like to look at that because really what I wanted to do was something like the pawn system. I wanted to have group combat and stuff like that, but that is quite complicated to get into. Even to present day, I'm not entirely sure how it would do companion AI. It is its own thing because there's a lot of logic and stuff you would have to account for. But I could probably fix Dragon's Dogma within like a weekend. And there's not, like, I can't even really think of games that really even come close to that in many respects. It's something that's really just like hard to put in words, but you'll sort of see what it is when you get into it. Because when I think of like the party-based stuff, I think of either of MMOs, which are pretty much universally garbage.
Yep.
Or I think of like JRPGs or something else that's more or less turn-based. Whereas this is, you really have to try to play around the pawns, and it will be very frustrating a lot of the times. It'll be entertaining in others because there's one box in Bitter Black where the bots just have to jump over it because it's an obstacle, and it's right in front of a cliff, so they just kill themselves every single time. But when it does work, it exposes a kind of gameplay that you just don't see really anywhere. And all the aspects they take from like Monster Hunter are all terrible because Monster Hunter is terrible. But just like that, beyond that, like the general combat and the feel of it is a little awkward, a little janky. But when you're playing like the faster classes or whatever, it's not too bad. When you're using a controller with a spell system, they managed to make targeting on the ground not amazing, but kind of more or less better than what you expected. And you know, like heals and stuff like that. It's our world objects. Like there's just like it's like an accumulation of little details that all kind of like stand out. And when you sit back and look at that composition, you think there's actually like a lot of like little interesting things in here. But a lot of the negative points in it really drag the whole experience down a lot. And I played through that game 3 times, and that's 3. Where I had the vanilla run, I had the original Dark Arisen run, and then I had the Dark Arisen XE run. And there's like the vanilla game is like, it's like a prototype that has some interesting ideas. And you hit Bitter Black and the quality of the game just plummets straight to the ground, right just a little bit above DMC5.
Okay. Interesting. So something that occurs to me is that the game that I have is Dark Arisen. I have no idea if that's the game I'm supposed to have.
Yes.
Okay.
That's an expansion. It has a whole thing though.
So it's still functional for playing the main game.
Oh yeah.
Okay. That was a concern.
Basically, what will happen?
Okay.
I don't know if anyone's ever told you about the progression for this game.
No.
But I have to remember specifically. But I think, because the game has several phases to it, basically. And there's a couple things that are probably going to catch you off guard I'm not going to bring up. But once you enter what I'll call post-game, I believe at that point you can enter Bitter Black Island. Bitter Black Island is the expansion area. You can think of it as like Act 5 in Diablo 2, but it's kind of independent from the main game. It is possible to actually go through the game, complete it, end it, without even ever touching Bitter Black. Bitter Black is kind of like almost an independent thing. But you can only initiate Bitter Black by going back to the starting area at nighttime. It'll trigger a cinematic, and there'll be an NPC that you can talk to, and then that will take you there. I think. If I'm remembering, it's been a while. But in order, you have to be in post-game for that to happen. I think you'll be able to recognize what post-game is. So, but yeah, you have the whole thing. So, because you can't get into Bitter Black early on anyways.
And you said earlier you would, like, for normal people, you would just say ignore that. But I imagine there's some, I don't know if it's value, but there's some reason to check it out or to get like a more complete picture. Because, you know, the other thing you were saying is that it's possible to go through the game solo. But it seems like if you want, like, say I'm going to play it once, I might not even complete it. If I just wanted the most complete image of what the game is on a single run, the most complete image I could get from a single playthrough, you know, what would be your recommendation as far as that goes? Should I actually engage?
Then I would say do it because you will experience the absolute worst of the game.
Gotcha.
And, you know, as far as like a run's content is concerned, I wouldn't say skip it.
Gotcha.
Because you will see how they take a lot of that potential and they completely destroy it. And you're also going to see what happens when you don't even bother to configure the pawns. And you're going to have shit like the dragons, where the pawns will only ever attack the tail and deal the least possible damage.
Okay.
And the end boss, both stages for him, the pawns are completely and absolutely brain dead, but especially the second phase for him will be probably some of the most frustrating shit that you'll experience in the genre of this.
See, it's a truism almost, but it feels like the most frustrated you can be as an enthusiast of games is when you play something that is like almost great or whatever, or has like obviously a lot of potential, and then it just squanders it, like you were saying. So
yeah.
I imagine as you're thinking about your time with this game, since you played through it 3 times, like you don't play, people who don't know that you don't usually play games more than you have to in a playthrough, right? Like you don't go back.
I don't play games too much at all.
Right.
Anymore,
yeah.
Really.
And it's like, it has to kind of speak to you on some level. So what was it, the pawn system? And like you said, like a mix of a bunch of other things, like the way that they handled certain combat, like what was it about, if you had to boil it down to some sort of pithy description, how would you describe the things that Dragon's Dogma has versus the things it doesn't? Like
aesthetic versus common sense.
Okay.
Like that's what's you're right. It's really frustrating because the things that are wrong are absolute common sense. So what makes a pawn so fucking brain dead, especially in Better Black, is, and this will happen in the vanilla game too, it's just slightly less common, is with the dragons. So one of the big, advertised features of Dragon's Dogma is large creatures with different like subsystems to them that you can attack and do different stuff. And the pawn system just wasn't designed with any of that in mind whatsoever. And it really shows, particularly with the dragons, where only the hearts will really take much damage. And the pawns will ignore those. Except for really specific cases where sometimes they try to climb onto the dragon when it's on the ground and then get to the heart, but they'll just kind of like spin around in place. And as a player, you'll also just spin around in place a lot too.
Oh, okay. Good.
And you realize the whole climbing system is just a stupid, dumb gimmick that should never have been there. But the dragons are the more graceful of the examples. When it comes to things like the ogres, then it turns into complete and total mental retardation every step of the way. And then you hit Bitter Black with the cursed dragons. And then things become absolutely fucking insanely stupid. And then there's a lot of really dumb things they throw in there that just make no sense at all. There's a gotcha in Bitter Black I'm not going to bring up because I want it to surprise you. And you're going to be wondering, why the fuck is this in the game? And then you're going to probably use a thing to make a macro key to macro QuickTime events. Because that's what drunken Swedish people did. Because otherwise it's not actually possible for you to clear these QuickTime events with low stats. And the dragons have an ability that instantly drops all pawns. So you have to run around reviving them constantly. It's just like a little chore that just threw in there just for the fun of it.
No.
And I mean, it kind of makes sense in one sense because there's like a writing justification for it, but it makes absolutely no sense from a gameplay perspective whatsoever why this exists. It's literally there just to be annoying. Yeah. But beyond that, there's a lot of damage in the game that is super dangerous and super lethal, and the pawns will just happily just stand in it, walk into it. They have no sense of preservation whatsoever. And with some of the bosses, it's at the point like if you're not attacking the weak spot at specific points, there's no point in being anywhere near it. The bots won't use spells remotely intelligently whatsoever, and like it. And then there's the inclination system on top of it that can really fuck with ranged pawns. And like you just want the pawns just to spam their fucking tenfold or whatever on cooldown. Just keep spamming it. It does damage. No, let's run around and auto attack every now and then. Like that it's like very basic logic stuff that's just going to drive you nuts.
Gotcha.
And then, when it works, it's great. Like, the pawn that I had it configured in such a way where it would sometimes use Skull Splitter. And, when it used it reliably, it would just like insta-get bosses in Better Black. It would just like kill everything it touched. But most of the time, they just kind of like run around. Like, the pathing is just... It's like the drones... When you brought your shit to the drones and CMBW, at least when I played the one time, you probably maybe fixed it by now. And they just kind of like, they leave the minerals, but they get stuck in one spot and kind of spin around like in StarCraft 2. The pawns just do that all the fucking time for no reason at all. And it's like they have no sense of like, oh, this is a low-level wolf. and I'm level 90 in like fucking Bitter Black gear. Maybe I don't need to run around in circles and try to run away from it. No, just kill the fucking thing. No, gonna run around in circles. So,
Nice.
there's just like a lot of really basic logic issues like that. So the gameplay really drags it down. But like the aesthetic is really like the lighting and stuff like that's really attractive. There's a lot less of like the invisible Omni lights everywhere that modern Western developers are obsessed with because they suck at doing level design. And there's like the lanterns and stuff like that. Like the aesthetic and the appearance of stuff, especially, you know, the consistency of it is quite alluring. And then, you know, you get into the actual like gameplay, especially when you get more or less in the later half of the game, you realize just how little attention anybody, especially at Pr0nogo, put into this entire product. And I know it had a really rough production schedule, but there's a lot of like it's just common sense stuff that really drags it down. Things that's like absolutely baffling why they put any time into it at all, like the QTEs and the climbing and stuff like that. Just it didn't work. And it really drags it down a lot. And especially if you do the higher difficulty, because there's 2 difficulty settings, and the other difficulty, there was no attention put to that whatsoever. I think it might increase the experience you get. I'm not sure. Enemies randomly drop 10,000 gold, which is busted as fuck. And the damage that you take from skills is increased by like 10-fold. So enemies will just like randomly out of nowhere instantly kill you. Even if you're in like the heaviest armor of the game, you just can instantly die.
That sounds like a worse experience, even when it's benefiting you, because it's not giving you like what I'm reading or hearing from that is don't pick the higher difficulty.
Yeah, I would recommend against it, especially as your first playthrough, because it's dumb. The other thing that will really knock you up is the damage thresholds for armor in Bitter Black are really, really, really rigid, and nothing in the game explains any of that to you whatsoever. But basically, in order to deal damage to the highest level stuff in the game, you absolutely have to have tier 3 weapons. Unless you level up your character in a very specific way, which is also not explained to you because your stats the stats increase as your levels based on what class you are. If you don't do that, you can really fuck up your stats, and you need to hit certain damage thresholds to deal damage to stuff in Bitter Black, especially. This is for the entire game, I'm pretty sure, but the scaling isn't nearly like that in the vanilla game. But when you hit Bitter Black, it can become a serious issue where, especially spell damage, it's very hard to deal any damage with spells because things have innate resistances, and then they have such high magic armor. And you can really fuck yourself out in Bitter Black, where if you've leveled up in a certain way, you plainly will not deal any damage to anything, even if you ascend to level 200. And there's ways to deal damage with like, there's ways you can cheese stuff. I believe that the explosive flasks might just deal a damage that ignores armor or something like that. You can just spam those. But as far as like just general gameplay with like the spells and stuff is concerned, because I played a caster in 2 of my runs, and it was a mess. But there's some broken shit you can do with spells in the rest of the game though. So that's the other thing that's really interesting about Dragon's Dogma is some of the spells they give you are just flat out fucking busted as hell. Most notably being Maelstrom, which can stun lock many enemies in the game that nothing else can stun. And the way that the damage and everything works is it's actually capable of shredding subsystems off of some units. And it's just like, it's really like unexpectedly how some of this stuff handles, especially in context of spellcasting in other games. How they behave, how complex they can actually be. Because like Maelstrom summons a tornado, and the tornado actually seems to have damage collision that follows its body in its position, which can be manipulated to hit things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to hit with just like a radial damage. So it's really actually fascinating in many little, again, the small details really stand out in many respects, but as a body, the execution is just like ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous. I'm going to go AFK again. I'm going to check up on this stuff and see how things are shaping up.
So based on your description of Dragon's Dogma, it sounds like it's very much a flawed and incomplete step towards a very different outlook of what this kind of game could be. And we've talked before as well about like Do you call it an ARPG? Because that kind of invokes like isometric Diablo type games. And then like, well, what is it then? What is it really? It's an action game, a 3D action game. And sometimes it has progression, and sometimes it seems to have these like spell casting systems and the pawn system. And, what can really be done with that? But it does sound like it was still a game that, gave you a lot to think about and mull over while you're trying to design your own content. And so that kind of brings me to the final question, which is, assuming things continue, like they're stable enough for you to get the December demo out, and if that were to hypothetically be the last major milestone in development, or the last one that gets publicly, or not really publicly, but distributed amongst people, how different would your version of the game's genre be than some of these past titles that you've worked on? And in what ways would you say that you've like really gravitated towards things the most from these past experiences? Is it just the aesthetics, right? Are you trying to unify the aesthetics and the common sense, or what are some things that you think are gonna be familiar to people who have played past games in the genre, and what are some things that are going to be completely different?
I think it's gonna really strike a lot of vibes with Dark Souls in particular, because I went for, well, Arbiter in general is a very Dark Souls looking zone because it's like a Gothic castle, so Gothic church kind of area. So it's just in general going to look kind of like Dark Souls. I actually posted a screenshot in an unrelated server, and someone thought it was Elden Ring. So it must be. I must be really close to that too. Obviously, there's going to be like science fiction areas and more elaborate areas and stuff.
Sure,
if we get to that point, but just in terms of what this demo is, it will certainly strike, I think, a lot of chords with that. And the particle design, I'm hoping, will strike a lot of chords with Dragon's Dogma. I think Dragon's Dogma probably has the strongest particle effects of any of the action RPGs I've played, and there's definitely some problems with it. Like in my XE run, I ran a mod that greatly reduced the opacity or removed some of the glow overlays that they have in it, because some of them are really obnoxiously large and high opacity. But beyond that, it's the visual direction of it is very clean, and more importantly is that the particle effects and stuff like that are really grounded in the game world, and that's something I've always aimed for. So that's certainly something that we really want for this. So I think that is probably something else that will stand out, is, although I haven't really done a lot of particle work, what is there should be more grounded, and I believe to be of a substantially higher quality than just about every other example I've ever seen with an Unreal 4 or 5 thus far. So just cherry picking what I do have access to in terms of third-party assets, tweaking them, or otherwise making my own, like what I did for the Voidhound, what I'm doing for another unit and other stuff like that. Just what little bit is there should feel grounded, and that, at least with familiarity with Dragon's Dogma, should kind of remind you of that. But beyond that, you're going to probably if you have any familiarity with DMC, etc., you're going to notice immediately that this is completely unalike in how it actually plays. It'll be the most similar to those Star Wars games that I mentioned before, with the exception that there's not really much attack moving in this. But it'll be a similar sense. There's no lock on. It's more free. And I honestly, I've hypothesized having some kind of active parry system, kind of like those games, but balancing it can be really hard. So I don't know, but that would be like a distant future kind of thing. Evidently, since I've had to cut so much from the demo, and there's still a lot that I need to do if I want to get to that point, how it's going to differ, how I hope it differs, is that like Dragon's Dogma, it kind of represents a bunch of ideas and their potentials. Obviously, I want this to be super difficult, and it's not going to be super difficult. It'll actually surprise me if anybody really has a lot of problems with this, especially once they're more or less familiar with the movement system. But what I hope is it illuminates the path to greatness in that sense. that it shows what can be done and raises the expectations of what people want out of these games. I think in many senses, it's probably going to distance itself quite a lot from the average action RPG because I think the exploration aspect of it will actually be a lot slower, especially for people who aren't familiar with the layout of the maps like I am. I think that from the casual / entry level perspective, this will play probably more slowly than Dark Souls does by a substantial amount outside of the combat in itself. But at the same time, the way I approach the gameplay from this is almost like I would StarCraft, where I think to really get the full breadth of it, you have to experience it in a long period of time. Like certain matchups, you're not going to learn how to play StarCraft in one run, in a sense that I think it will take, not just from playing, but also from developing, a distance of time to really appreciate the full breadth of what is actually there. So, I don't know. It'll be an interesting experience because I think that the way that I compare it is going to be completely different than what other people compare it. And that, like, the whole thing of me releasing something that is in such a state of incompletion is really not something I like doing in general. So that also is going to be different for me. But on one hand, I'm actually really interested to see how others view those changes because, well, I guess that most of the people who are going to be playing this or seeing it aren't really intimately familiar with this stuff in general. So,
right, that's one of the reasons why I was trying to, kick up some games that are sort of related in recent history, is so that I can be a little bit more informed as to, what kinds of things are iterated upon here, in terms of the broad genre conceptions.
Mm-hmm.
So, but no, I think the benefit of, and I've obviously experienced this myself lately with Cosmonic and Brood War, is that the benefit of releasing something incomplete or in a state of, development, it's not a complete thing, and it changes a lot, and there's going to be different expectations, and like maybe the trap is that you just keep releasing stuff and you're working on stuff so that you can make the next release instead of trying to just complete it, right? So there's like there are pros and cons to the approach, but one of the benefits is definitely that you get to have this conversation with people whose opinion you trust, right? And you get to have that sort of teamwork associated with the project, even if you're the one doing the vast majority or all of the creative decisions about the game design. You still get to have a conversation with people about it as it's shaping up. And for something that is, I've gone back and forth on this as to whether or not, I definitely don't think when we're releasing actual games, we would ever do early access. Like, that's pretty much no. Like, it's just never a good idea. You're charging money for a project that you are saying is incomplete. And, also the whole point is that we give a good first impression whenever you buy a product from us. So we're not going to give you the option to like play it for free, but before it's complete either, because the whole point is then your first impression is completely different, right? Because now it's some alpha or whatever. None of it makes any sense to me, even if the only way it makes sense is if you really want that money sooner. And, we're trying to not be like the rest of the industry. But when you're thinking about it in the terms of, would you, like with Cosmonic and Brood War or with this demo, it's like you're working on something that is completely different than most people's conceptions of the genre are, than any past experience that they've had than any past experiment with the genre has ever given. You're providing something that is completely different, even if it's, maybe there's not one individual thing that has never been tried before in the space of gaming, but there's a lot of, like, the consortium of the final output is really what's different. Like that, the way that it all comes together, it's the culmination of all these different things that does give you a very different experience. And, it's the same deal with Dragon's Dogma in a way, I guess, is that like it has this thing, the pawn system, that's like completely different than what you would experience in other games that are like this. And so if you wanted to tie it into that, it's like when you're doing something that is you talked about the cutting edge technology with this new Unreal stuff, but it's like, what if you're doing something on the cutting edge of conceptuals, like you're on the idea island, you're trying to figure out like where the next path is and what it could even be. And so I think having a conversation about that, like, maybe there are people out there who prefer to or would find it more useful to not have a conversation about that with anybody, not explore that with anybody else, just explore it solo. And then eventually, distribute their works or not. And then, we never really hear about them. But I don't think it's a bad thing to explore that with other people who as long as there's like an agreed upon foundational basis for, you and I have similar standards for software, and like there's enough common ground with you and everybody else who you're going to be sending this to that is, you guys can actually communicate in a deep manner about the stuff. So it just seems to me like there's a very lacking, like there's a big lack of exploration happening at all. And so if this is one of the ways that it can be done, it seems like a worthwhile trade-off.
Yeah, so I've just been told that the landlord is about to be here last minute.
Classic.
And that's great. I love having these interruptions like that, especially this one that I don't know what the hell's going on.
Right.
But
shall we fingers crossed for good news and leave it there, or what
I
do you
think
think?
he is just here to finally plug a hole that the birds are getting in.
Caw.
So yeah, unfortunately, I have to ditch now because I gotta clean up some stuff. So
Sure, yeah.
I would like to revisit this stuff later though, sometime. So
in that case, stay tuned for the next episode as we march towards episode 69 of the Big Boys Table. And thank you for joining us, Mesk.
Wish this chaos would end. I've got to kill chaos.
I must kill chaos.